rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, obscuring the city skyline, when Bennett walked through the front door, holding another woman's hand. He didn't look ashamed. He looked defiant. He expected his wife to scream, to break plates, to beg him to explain. He thought she was just a small-town girl with nowhere else to go, financially tied to his tech startup wealth. He was wrong. She wasn't just walking out of his house today. She was going back to a throne he never knew existed. Lemons always smelled like obligation to Josephine. She was standing at the cold expanse of the white quartz kitchen island, dragging a paring knife through the thick yellow rind of a Meyer lemon, preparing the garnish for Bennett's evening gin and tonic. It was a Tuesday. It was 6:15 p.m. The hum of the Sub-Zero refrigerator provided a low, vibrating bass line to the quiet house. The front door's heavy deadbolt clacked open. Josephine didn't look up immediately. She focused on keeping the slices even, feeling the sharp sting of acidic juice, finding a microscopic paper cut on her left index finger. Footsteps echoed in the foyer. Not just Bennett's familiar, heavy-heeled leather boots. There was a secondary sound, a rubbery squeak against the oak floorboards. A wet, hesitant drag. "Joe, we need to talk." Bennett's voice bounced off the high, sterile walls of the open-concept living room. He sounded breathless, artificially inflated, like a man who had practiced his lines in the rearview mirror for an hour. Josephine set the knife down on the marble cutting board. She wiped her hands on a linen towel, folding it precisely in half, then in quarters, before finally turning around. Bennett stood at the edge of the kitchen. He was wearing his expensive camel hair overcoat, the shoulders darkened by the rain. Beside him, clutching a faded olive green canvas duffel bag, was a woman. She looked to be in her mid-20s. Her blonde hair was damp, plastered against her cheeks, and she smelled strongly of artificial vanilla perfume and wet denim. Her eyes darted around the expensive kitchen, landing everywhere except on Josephine. "This is Gemma," Bennett said. He didn't let go of the girl's hand. In fact, he squeezed it, shifting his weight. "She's moving in." Josephine stared. She didn't feel the sudden, catastrophic heartbreak the movies promised. There was no roaring in her ears. Instead, she felt a profound, heavy nausea, settling in the pit of her stomach like a swallowed stone. Her eyes drifted from Bennett's flushed, aggressive face down to Gemma's boots. They were scuffed brown leather, leaving a small, muddy puddle on the pristine hardwood. "I see," Josephine said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the hysterical pitch Bennett was clearly bracing for. "Look, I don't want to do the whole screaming match thing," Bennett continued, his tone adopting that placating, corporate cadence he used when firing contractors. "I love you, Joe. I do. But Gemma and we have a connection. A deep one. I'm not kicking you out. This house is massive. There are 5 bedrooms. We can be adults about this. Polyamory is a perfectly valid lifestyle choice." He stumbled slightly over the word polyamory. He had probably read a think piece about it on a flight to Silicon Valley and decided it was the perfect intellectual shield for his infidelity. Gemma shifted her weight, her wet jacket rustling. She finally looked at Josephine. There was a flicker of defiance in the girl's eyes, masked quickly by a manufactured, pitiful innocence. "I don't want to take your place," Gemma murmured, her voice reedy and thin. "Bennett he says there's room for both of us to grow here." Josephine looked back at the lemon slices on the cutting board. The sheer absurdity of the moment made her jaw ache. She realized with a startling clarity that she didn't hate Gemma. She just found her incredibly tacky, and she realized she didn't love Bennett anymore. Maybe she hadn't for a long time. The man standing before her, puffing out his chest, trying to dress up his midlife cliché and progressive therapy speak, was pathetic. "You want her to live here?" Josephine said slowly, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "I want us to try," Bennett insisted, taking a step forward. He reached out as if to touch Josephine's arm, but stopped when she didn't move to meet him. "Joe, be reasonable. Where would you even go? You don't have an income right now. Your family in Europe hasn't spoken to you in years. I'm offering you security. We can make this work." "Where would you even go?" The words hung in the air, mixing with the cloying scent of vanilla and the sharp tang of citrus. He thought she was a captive. 5 years ago, Josephine had walked away from a life of crushing protocol, endless scrutiny, and centuries of inherited obligation. She had traded the stifling, velvet-draped halls of the Laurentian royal estate for this modern, glass-walled box because Bennett had promised her normalcy. She had hidden her title, her lineage, her trust funds behind a quiet, middle-class facade. She wanted to be a regular wife to a regular man. She had made herself small so Bennett could feel big. "Gemma," Josephine said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying a calm authority that made the younger woman flinch. "Did you wipe your feet on the mat outside?" Gemma blinked, clearly thrown by the question. What?" "The floor. You're tracking mud onto the oak." Bennett let out a sharp, exasperated laugh. "Jesus, Joe, are you serious? I'm laying my cards on the table. I'm trying to restructure our marriage with honesty, and you're talking about the floorboards?" "It's a simple question," Josephine replied. She turned her back on them, walking over to the sink to wash the lemon juice off her stinging finger. The water ran cold over her skin. She watched it spiral down the stainless steel drain. "You should take your boots off, Gemma. The wood warps easily." She shut off the tap and dried her hands. When she turned back around, Bennett looked furious. Her lack of a breakdown was robbing him of his narrative. He couldn't play the magnanimous, patient husband calming his hysterical wife. "I'm going upstairs," Josephine said. She walked past them, giving them a wide berth, deliberately avoiding the damp air radiating from Gemma's coat. "Joe, we aren't done talking," Bennett called out, his voice sharp now, the veneer of patience cracking. "We are," Josephine said, not looking back as she reached the bottom of the staircase. "I'll be out of your way shortly." The thick gray wool carpet on the stairs swallowed the sound of Josephine's footsteps. She walked with deliberate slowness. Her knees felt a little weak, a quiet tremor vibrating through her thighs, betraying the calm exterior she had just projected. She entered the master bedroom. It was a massive, cavernous space, decorated in tones of slate and oatmeal. Bennett had hired an interior designer who insisted that color was a sign of emotional clutter. Josephine had always hated this room. It felt like sleeping in a high-end waiting area. She walked past the king-sized bed and went straight to the walk-in closet. She didn't grab the sleek, hard-shelled Rimowa suitcases Bennett had bought her for their honeymoon in Aspen. Instead, she moved to the very back, pushing aside rows of dry-cleaned silk blouses and cashmere sweaters she rarely wore. From the top shelf, she pulled down a battered dark green leather weekender bag, It was scuffed at the corners, the brass hardware oxidized and dull. She dropped it onto the upholstered bench in the center of the closet. The heavy thud felt incredibly satisfying. Josephine unzipped the bag. The air inside smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. It was the scent of her previous life. Downstairs she could hear the faint murmur of voices. Bennett was talking low and fast. Gemma gave a short, reedy laugh. The sound drifted up through the floor vents, scraping against Josephine's eardrums. She felt a sudden, sharp prickle of heat behind her eyes. The humiliation was finally setting in, creeping up her throat like bile. 5 years. She had spent 5 years learning how to cook his favorite meals, listening to him complain about his board of directors, pretending not to notice when his eyes lingered on younger women at restaurants. She had given up her country for this man. She swallowed hard, forcing the tears back. Crying was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. She opened her dresser. She bypassed the expensive lingerie Bennett liked and pulled out her oldest, most comfortable clothes. Thick wool socks, a pair of heavy denim jeans, a faded black turtleneck. She rolled them tightly, shoving them into the leather bag. Then she moved to the small safe bolted into the floor of the closet. She punched in the 6-digit code. The heavy steel door clicked open. Inside sat the jewelry Bennett had gifted her. A diamond tennis bracelet, a pair of sapphire studs, a delicate platinum watch. She left all of it. Instead, she reached all the way to the back and pulled out a small, velvet-lined wooden box. Josephine sat on the edge of the bench, resting the box on her knees. She opened it. Inside rested a heavy, solid gold signet ring. The crest of the House of Laurentia, a rampant stag flanked by twin oak branches, was deeply engraved into the metal. It belonged to her grandfather. It was heavy, ostentatious, and represented everything she had run away from. She took it out of the box and slipped it onto her right index finger. The gold was cold against her skin. It felt heavy. It felt right. Beside the ring box was her passport. Not the blue American one she used for vacations with Bennett. This one was a deep, imposing crimson, embossed with the gold crest of her sovereign state. The name printed inside wasn't Josephine Miller. It was Her Serene Highness, Princess Josephine Charlotte Valeran of Laurentia. She tossed the passport into the green leather bag. Footsteps sounded on the stairs, heavy, fast. Bennett. He appeared in the doorway of the closet, leaning against the frame. He had taken off his coat, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his slacks. He looked at the battered green bag, then at her. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Packing," Josephine said, not looking at him. She grabbed a handful of toiletries from the bathroom counter and dropped them into a side pouch. "Don't be dramatic, Joe. You don't have to leave tonight. It's pouring rain outside." He sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose, a gesture he used when he wanted to show how burdened he was by her incompetence. "Where are you even going to go? A hotel? Your joint card is linked to my account. I'll get an alert the second you run it. Just stay in the guest room. We can sort out the logistics tomorrow." He genuinely believed she was helpless. The arrogance of it was almost breathtaking. He had financially isolated her for so long that he thought the cage was completely locked. "I won't be needing your credit card, Bennett," she said, zipping the bag closed. The metallic teeth caught for a second, then slid shut with a decisive rasp. "Oh, right. You're going to call your mysterious European relatives?" Bennett laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. The ones who didn't even show up to our wedding? Be real, Josephine. You haven't spoken to them in years. You have no money of your own. You have no job. You are going to walk out that door, get soaked in the rain, and call me in 3 hours, begging me to pay for an Uber back. Josephine grabbed the leather handles of the bag. She stood up, turning to face him. She didn't shrink away this time. She let her spine straighten. Years of posture lessons, beaten into her by strict governesses, took over. She pulled her shoulders back, her chin lifting slightly. "Move," she said. Bennett frowned, unsettled by the shift in her demeanor. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't crying. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, carrying a cold, aristocratic detachment that he had never heard before. He hesitated, then took a half step back, allowing her to pass. As she walked down the hallway, she heard the toilet flush in the guest bathroom. Gemma stepped out, wiping her hands on her jeans. She froze when she saw Josephine carrying the bag. "Oh," Gemma breathed, looking panicked. "You're actually leaving?" Josephine paused. She looked at the younger woman. Up close, Gemma looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes, her makeup slightly smeared. She was just a pawn, a messy, naive girl who thought she had won a prize. "He likes his coffee black, but he'll complain if you don't offer him cream," Josephine said, her tone conversational. "He leaves his wet towels on the floor, and if you ask him to pick them up, he'll tell you you're nagging. He will buy you very expensive things, but he will remind you exactly how much they cost every time you argue." Gemma swallowed hard, clutching the door frame. "Good luck," Josephine added, and walked past her, heading for the stairs. The descent down the stairs felt remarkably long. The green leather bag bumped against Josephine's thigh with every step. Her heart was finally starting to beat faster, a nervous flutter in her rib cage. She was really doing it. The safety net she had woven out of mediocrity and silence was gone. She was stepping back into the fire. She reached the bottom of the stairs and walked into the foyer. She dropped the bag onto the floor and pulled her cell phone from her pocket. She scrolled past Bennett's name, past her local friends, past the dry cleaner. She reached the very bottom of her contacts. A number she hadn't dialed in 5 years, saved under a single initial, P. She tapped it. The phone rang once, twice. "Yes?" The voice on the other end was crisp, accented, and immediately alert. "Philip," Josephine said, keeping her voice low. There was a fraction of a second of dead silence. Then a sharp intake of breath. "Your Highness?" Hearing the title out loud for the first time in half a decade sent a strange electric shock down her spine. "I need extraction," she said simply. "Location?" Philip didn't ask questions. He didn't ask how she was or why she was calling after 5 years of total blackout. He was the head of the Laurentian Royal Security Detail. His only job was logistics. "My residence in Seattle, the Mercer Island address." "Understood. We have assets in the city. ETA is 12 minutes. Are you in immediate physical danger, ma'am?" "No," Josephine said, glancing toward the kitchen. She could hear Bennett pouring a drink, the familiar clink of ice against crystal. "Just ideological danger. Hurry. We are on our way." The line clicked dead. Josephine slipped the phone back into her pocket. She leaned against the cold front door, closing her eyes. 12 minutes. She just had to survive 12 minutes. "Who were you calling?" She opened her eyes. Bennett was walking into the foyer, holding a tumbler of amber liquid. He took a sip, the ice clinking. He looked smug. He had realized she was waiting, which meant she didn't have a car. "Calling a cab?" he asked, leaning against the archway. "I checked the app. It's surging right now. Wait, time is 40 minutes. You're going to be standing there a while." Josephine didn't answer. She looked at the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. "Joe, this is ridiculous," Bennett continued, swirling the liquor in his glass. "Come back into the kitchen. Gemma is making tea. Let's just sit down and map this out. You're emotional right now. You aren't thinking clearly." "I am thinking perfectly clearly, Bennett." "Then why are you standing by the door like a stray dog? You don't have anywhere to go." His voice lost its fake sympathy, turning hard and cruel. "I know your bank accounts, Josephine. I know what you have. You can't even afford a deposit on an apartment in this city." He wanted her to beg. He wanted her to break down, to admit defeat, to crawl back into the kitchen and accept the humiliating terms of his new arrangement. He fed on the power imbalance. 7 minutes left. The rain continued to beat against the windows, a relentless drumming rhythm. Gemma hovered in the background, peeking around the corner of the kitchen wall, holding a steaming mug, watching the scene unfold like a daytime soap opera. 10 minutes left. "I'm giving you one last chance, Joe," Bennett said, pushing off the archway and walking toward her. He pointed a finger at her. "Take off your coat. Unpack that ridiculous bag. Because if you walk out that door, I'm shutting off your phone plan and canceling your cards tonight. You'll be on the street." Suddenly, a blinding wash of white light swept across the sheer curtains of the front windows. Bennett stopped talking, shielding his eyes from the glare. It wasn't the dim yellow headlights of a taxi. It was bright, aggressive LED lighting. Through the glass, Josephine could see the massive, shadowy silhouettes of 3 identical black Cadillac Escalades pulling into the circular driveway. The heavy tires crunched loudly over the wet gravel, the sound completely dominating the quiet suburban street. "What the hell is that?" Bennett muttered, setting his glass down on a console table. He walked toward the window, peering through the rain. "Did you call the police?" Josephine grabbed the handle of her leather bag. "No." The doors of the lead Escalade opened simultaneously. 4 men stepped out into the pouring rain. They didn't run for cover. They moved with absolute, terrifying precision. They wore dark, tailored suits, their earpieces barely visible in the shadows. One of them walked directly to the front door, while the others fanned out, their eyes scanning the perimeter of the property. Bennett looked genuinely panicked now. "Joe, who are these people?" Before she could answer, a sharp, heavy knock rattled the front door. 3 distinct raps. Josephine reached out and turned the deadbolt. She pulled the heavy oak door open. The man standing on the porch was tall, his broad shoulders blocking out the streetlights. Rain beaded on the shoulders of his immaculate charcoal suit. His face was unreadable, completely devoid of emotion. It was Thomas, one of Philip's top lieutenants. Josephine remembered him from when he was just a junior guard at the palace. He had aged, his hair graying at the temples. Thomas stepped into the threshold, ignoring Bennett entirely. He looked at Josephine, his eyes flicking briefly down to the battered green bag, then up to her face. He noted the heavy gold signet ring on her finger. Without a word, Thomas bowed, a deep, formal bend of the waist that was incredibly jarring in the sterile foyer of a Seattle suburban home. "Your Highness," Thomas said, his voice deep and resonant. The convoy is ready. We apologize for the delay." Bennett stared at the man, his mouth slightly open. He looked from Thomas to Josephine, then back to Thomas. "You're... what? Who are you? You can't just come into my house." Thomas slowly straightened. He looked at Bennett for the first time. The security operative didn't look angry. He looked at Bennett the way one might look at an insect on the sidewalk, a minor, insignificant obstacle. "I will take your bag, Your Highness," Thomas said, reaching out. Josephine let him take the heavy leather weekender. She adjusted the collar of her coat. She looked at Bennett one last time. All the arrogance, all the smug superiority had vanished from her husband's face. He looked pale, confused, and suddenly very small. The reality he had constructed, the one where he held all the power, all the money, all the control, was fracturing right in front of him. "Josephine," Bennett whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "What is going on?" She stepped out onto the porch, out of his reach. The cold night air hit her face, crisp and damp. "Goodbye, Bennett," she said. She didn't wait for a response. She walked down the concrete steps. 2 guards immediately flanked her, holding large black umbrellas to shield her from the rain. One of them opened the heavy reinforced door of the middle escalade. Josephine climbed into the back seat. The leather was warm, the interior completely silent, insulated from the storm outside. Thomas slid into the front passenger seat and pulled the door shut, severing the connection to the driveway. Through the tinted window, she could see Bennett standing on the porch, getting soaked by the blowing rain, staring after the cars. Gemma had come to the door, peering out over his shoulder. They looked small, insignificant. "To the airfield, ma'am?" Thomas asked over his shoulder. Josephine looked down at the heavy gold ring on her hand. She turned it slowly, feeling the raised edges of the royal crest. "Yes, Thomas," she said softly. "Take me home." Raindrops tracked across the double-paned acrylic of the Gulfstream's window, stretching into long, horizontal streaks as the jet achieved cruising altitude. Josephine pressed her forehead against the cool glass. The vibration of the Rolls-Royce engines hummed through her jawbone, a steady mechanical purr that was entirely at odds with the frantic, jagged beating of her heart. Leather creaked softly behind her. Philip moved with the silent, predatory grace she remembered from her youth. He set a crystal tumbler down on the burled walnut table at her elbow. The amber liquid inside sloshed slightly, catching the warm, recessed cabin lighting. "Highland Park, 18 years. Neat," Philip murmured, his voice barely rising above the engine noise. "As you used to prefer, Your Highness." Josephine turned away from the window. She looked at the Scotch, then at Philip. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, his posture impeccably straight, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. He hadn't aged, exactly, but the lines around his eyes were deeper, carved by half a decade of managing crises she had blissfully ignored. "I haven't had Scotch in 3 years," she said, her voice sounding raspy, foreign in her own ears. "Bennett said it made my breath smell like a campfire." Philip's expression remained perfectly neutral. He did not offer pity. He did not offer judgment. "Shall I have the steward prepare a gin and tonic?" "God, no." Josephine picked up the heavy crystal. She took a slow sip. The liquor burned a fiery, complex trail down her throat, tasting of peat moss, sea salt, and old oak. It was jarring. It was magnificent. She closed her eyes, letting the heat bloom in her chest, displacing the lingering chill of the Seattle rain. When she opened them, Philip had placed a slim leather folder on the table next to her drink. "A preliminary briefing," he explained, stepping back to give her space. "Your grandfather's health has declined significantly in the last 72 hours. He is currently resting at the summer estate. Your sister, Princess Vivian, is acting regent in all but name. The public has been told he is suffering from mild fatigue." Josephine stared at the embossed leather folder. The reality of what she had just done was beginning to settle over her, heavy and suffocating. She hadn't just left a cheating husband. She had pulled the ripcord on her exile. She had promised herself on a rainy Tuesday 5 years ago that she would never go back to the crushing protocol, the endless scrutiny, the feeling of being a chess piece on a geopolitical board. She had chosen mundane misery over extraordinary duty, and now she was flying back into the cage at 500 miles an hour. "Does Vivian know I'm coming?" Josephine asked, her fingers tracing the condensation on her glass. "I informed Her Highness 40 minutes ago, once you were secure on the aircraft." "And?" Philip hesitated. It was a micro expression, a tiny tightening of his jaw, but Josephine caught it. "Her Highness suggested that you enter through the private underground motorcade route to avoid the evening press corps." Josephine let out a short, hollow laugh. "She wants me hidden. She's furious." "She is managing a delicate transition of power, ma'am. Your sudden reappearance complicates the narrative." Josephine leaned back in the plush, cream-colored seat, sinking into the upholstery. She looked down at her hands. The gold signet ring felt impossibly heavy on her index finger, digging into her knuckle. She thought of Bennett's face on the porch, the sheer, unadulterated shock. He had spent years chipping away at her confidence, telling her she was lucky he put up with her lack of ambition, her quiet nature. He had weaponized her chosen anonymity against her. A sharp spike of shame pierced her ribs. Not shame for leaving, but shame for staying as long as she did. She had let a mediocre man with a mediocre startup treat a sovereign princess like a stray dog because she had been so desperate for a normal life. She opened the leather folder. Inside were satellite photos of the palace, lists of current cabinet members, and medical reports. It smelled faintly of printer toner and expensive paper. It smelled like work. "Philip," she said, not looking up from the documents. "Yes, Your Highness." "When we land, I don't want to use the underground route." She flipped a page, her jaw setting into a hard, rigid line. "Have the motorcade pull up to the grand courtyard. If I'm coming back from the dead, I might as well use the front door." Understood. Fog hung thick over the private airstrip in the Laurentian Alps, carrying the sharp medicinal scent of pine needles and aviation exhaust. The transition from the climate-controlled jet to the biting European dawn was a physical shock. Josephine pulled her thin wool coat tighter around her shoulders, her breath pluming in the freezing air as she descended the air stairs. There were no red carpets, no brass bands, just the bleak gray morning and a line of armored Mercedes sedans waiting on the wet tarmac, their engines idling with a low, menacing growl. The drive to the capital took 40 minutes. Josephine watched the jagged, snow-capped peaks give way to centuries-old stone architecture. The city woke up around them, oblivious to the fact that its prodigal daughter was sliding through its streets behind bulletproof glass. When they reached the palace, the heavy wrought iron gates swung open without a sound. The tires hissed over the cobblestones of the grand courtyard. Philip had followed her orders. They were parking at the main entrance, right at the base of the sweeping marble staircase. Josephine stepped out of the car. The palace smelled exactly as it had the day she left. A distinct aristocratic cocktail of cold limestone, centuries of burning beeswax candles, and the faint, dusty scent of antique tapestry wool. It was a smell that commanded silence. She walked up the steps, her scuffed boots echoing sharply. The royal guards, standing at attention in their crimson and charcoal uniforms, snapped perfectly in sync, their white-gloved hands gripping their ceremonial rifles. They did not look at her. They looked through her. At the top of the stairs, waiting just inside the massive oak doors, was Vivienne. Josephine stopped. The two sisters stared at each other across 10 feet of polished marble. Vivienne was 3 years older, and she looked as though she had been born wearing the structured, slate-gray Dior suit she currently had on. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless chignon. Her cheekbones were sharp, her posture rigid, her eyes a flat, terrifying shade of ice blue. She looked like a monarch. She looked exhausted. "You wore denim," Vivienne said. Her voice echoed in the cavernous entry hall, perfectly modulated, devoid of any warmth. "I was in a rush," Josephine replied, her throat tight. Vivienne's eyes flicked down to the battered green weekender bag Thomas was carrying a few paces behind Josephine. Clearly, the older sister took a slow, measured step forward. The smell of her perfume, jasmine and cold steel, hit Josephine like a physical blow. It brought back a rush of childhood memories, stiff dresses, endless etiquette lessons, Vivienne always getting the answers right while Josephine stared out the window. "Grandfather is dying," Vivienne stated, not as a tragedy, but as a logistical hurdle. "The Parliament is threatening a vote of no confidence in the Crown's ability to transition smoothly. We have a textile strike in the northern provinces, and now I have to deal with the resurrection of a ghost." Josephine swallowed the lump in her throat. "I'm not asking you to throw a parade, Viv. I needed to come home. Home," Vivienne repeated, testing the word on her tongue as if it tasted sour. She crossed her arms. "You abandoned this home because you found the pressure distasteful. You ran off to play house with an American tech salesman. Tell me, Josephine, did he tire of you? Or did you finally realize that playing at being a commoner is incredibly boring?" The words were calculated, designed to find the weakest point in Josephine's armor and twist. "He moved his mistress into my kitchen," Josephine said, the words falling flat and heavy onto the marble floor. For a fraction of a second, the ice in Vivienne's eyes cracked. A microscopic flinch of genuine shock, quickly buried under a lifetime of supreme discipline. Her gaze drifted to Josephine's hands, landing on the heavy gold signet ring on her right index finger. Vivienne exhaled, a slow, quiet sigh that ruffled the silence of the hall. "I suppose we will need to have his entire digital life scrubbed," she murmured, already running the damage control calculations in her head. "I will have intelligence pull his records. If he attempts to sell a story to the tabloids, we will crush him financially before he can hit send." He doesn't know who I am, Josephine said. He thinks I'm a broke expatriate with no family. Vivienne actually stopped. She tilted her head, looking at her younger sister as if examining a bizarre, slightly pathetic insect. You spent 5 years sleeping next to a man, and you never told him you were in the line of succession? I wanted him to love me for me, not the title. How wonderfully poetic, and how completely idiotic. Vivian turned on her heel, her stilettos clicking sharply. Come along, your old apartments have been aired out. You smell like commercial airline soap and desperation. We have a cabinet briefing in 3 hours, and you are going to sit beside me and look like you haven't spent the last half-decade baking sourdough in a suburb. Josephine didn't move immediately. She looked around the vast, echoing hall at the towering portraits of ancestors who had waged wars and signed treaties. She felt the crushing, familiar weight of the institution settling onto her shoulders, a yoke she had willingly picked back up. She tightened her grip on the strap of her purse, squared her shoulders, and followed her sister into the cold heart of the palace. Morning light in the east wing was notoriously unforgiving. It sliced through the towering leaded glass windows in harsh, blinding beams, illuminating every speck of dust dancing in the air. Josephine sat perfectly still at the vanity in her private dressing room. A small army of women moved around her in total silence. A seamstress was pinning the hem of a tailored midnight blue crepe dress, the fabric heavy and restrictive. A stylist was pulling Josephine's hair back, her knuckles grazing Josephine's scalp with sharp, impersonal efficiency. The air smelled of hot iron, hairspray, and the bitter, herbal tea sitting untouched on the silver tray beside her. She stared at her reflection in the gilded mirror. The woman looking back was a stranger. The soft, accommodating edges of Jo had been stripped away. Her cheekbones looked sharper. The dark circles under her eyes, born from a sleepless flight, made her look predatory rather than exhausted. The heavy gold ring caught the light as she rested her hand on her thigh. The heavy oak doors to her dressing room clicked open. Philip stepped inside, carrying an encrypted tablet. He paused, waiting for the attendants to step back. "Leave us," Josephine said. Her voice was quiet, but it commanded the room instantly. The women curtsied smoothly and filed out, leaving the room suffocatingly quiet. "Report," Josephine said, picking up the teacup. The porcelain was eggshell thin, fragile against her lips. Philip stepped forward, offering the tablet. "The American is attempting to make contact, Your Highness, with considerable aggression." Josephine took the tablet. The screen displayed a log of intercepted communications. 34 missed calls, 18 text messages, 4 voicemails. "Play them," she ordered, setting the tea down. Philip tapped the screen. Bennett's voice filled the opulent dressing room, the audio heavily compressed by international routing. "Joe, this isn't funny anymore. I don't know who those guys in the suits were, but you can't just stage a kidnapping to make a point. It's been 12 hours. I called the police, and they told me there's no record of you at the border. You need to come home right now. Gemma is freaking out. I am locking down the joint accounts. You have no money. Call me back." The next voicemail beeped. Bennett sounded less angry, more panicked. "Joe, seriously, where are you? The bank just called me. They said our joint accounts were emptied. All of it. $300,000 just gone. What did you do? Did you hire a hacker?" "This is a felony," Josephine, I swear to God, if you don't answer this phone, I am calling my lawyers. Josephine felt a cold, dark ripple of satisfaction in her chest. She looked up at Philip. The accounts? Standard protocol for asset recovery during an extraction, Your Highness, Philip replied, completely deadpan. The funds you deposited during the marriage have been repatriated to the Crown Treasury. We calculated his original contributions and left them. They amounted to $7,000. He is currently overdrawn. Josephine looked back at the screen. She tapped the third voicemail. Bennett's voice was frantic, his breathing shallow. Josephine, what the hell is happening? My company's server just crashed. My investors are getting emails from some offshore firm saying I'm under investigation for international fraud. The police just showed up at the house asking about my immigration paperwork for you. What did you do? Who are you? Please, just pick up the phone. The silence returned to the room, heavy and absolute. 5 years ago, a voicemail like that would have sent her into a panic. She would have apologized. She would have smoothed it over, made him tea, told him everything was fine. She had shrunk herself to fit into the tiny box of his ego. Now, listening to him unravel, she felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no residual love. He wasn't a monster. He was just a small, arrogant man who had made the catastrophic mistake of mistaking her silence for weakness. Do you want me to engage the legal team, ma'am? Philip asked. We can tie him up in international litigation for a decade. He won't be able to afford a bus ticket, let alone a lawyer. Josephine reached up and touched the heavy pearl earrings the stylist had clipped to her lobes. They pinched, a sharp physical reminder of where she was. No, she said softly. Philip raised an eyebrow. You wish to let him go? I wish for him to cease to exist in my world. Josephine handed the tablet back to the security chief. She stood up, the heavy midnight blue fabric falling perfectly into place around her legs. Block the numbers, drop the server attacks. Wipe my name from his marriage certificate. Burn the digital trail. If he tries to tell anyone he was married to me, I want him to look like a delusional man who hallucinated a wife. And the mistress? Philip asked. Leave her, Josephine said, turning back to the mirror to smooth a stray hair. She has to live with him now. That is punishment enough. Philip bowed his head. It will be done within the hour. He turned toward the door, then paused, his hand on the brass knob. Your sister is waiting in the corridor, Your Highness. The cabinet is assembled. Josephine took a deep breath. The air in the room tasted of expensive dust and duty. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, mourning the girl who used to slice lemons in a quiet, sunlit kitchen. That girl was dead. She opened her eyes, turning away from the mirror. Let's go, Her Serene Highness said. I have a country to run. Dust motes danced in the shafts of cold morning light that cut across the vaulted corridor. Josephine walked half a pace behind Vivienne, adjusting to the restrictive, heavy drape of her midnight blue dress. Her scalp still ached faintly from the tight hairpins, a dull, rhythmic throb that kept her tethered to the present moment. 2 sentries stood guard outside the cabinet room. They didn't just open the doors. They hauled them back with a synchronized muscular heave, the brass hinges letting out a low groan. The air inside the room hit Josephine instantly. It was a suffocating blend of stale espresso, nervous perspiration, and lemon oil furniture polish. The citrus scent struck her hard, a violent sensory callback to her kitchen in Seattle, to the knife slipping against the cutting board, to Gemma's muddy boots. Her stomach gave a sharp, involuntary lurch. She swallowed hard, forcing the nausea down, and stepped into the room. 14 men and 2 women sat around a massive, scarred mahogany table. They were the architects of Laurentia's daily survival, dressed in severe charcoal and black. As Vivian entered, they rose in a wave of scraping chair legs and rustling fabric. None of them expected the second figure. When Josephine stepped out from behind her sister's shadow, the silence in the room changed texture. It went from a respectful hush to a vacuum. Chancellor Davies, a man whose jowls had been aggressively descending for the last decade, actually dropped his gold pen. It clattered loudly against the polished wood. "Be seated," Vivian commanded, her voice slicing through the shock. She took the chair at the head of the table. She did not introduce her sister. She didn't need to. Josephine took the empty chair to Vivian's right. The leather was stiff, grooved by decades of nervous ministers. She rested her hands on the table, deliberately keeping the heavy gold signet ring visible. "We resume with the Northern Province crisis," Vivian said, opening a leather-bound folio. "Chancellor Davies, you have the floor." Davies cleared his throat, his eyes darting to Josephine before snapping back to his notes. He looked rattled, but his arrogance quickly smothered his surprise. "Yes, Your Highness. The textile union strike in Oak Haven has entered its 4th day. The factories are entirely paralyzed. They are demanding a 20% wage increase and winter heating subsidies. They know His Majesty is unwell. They are leveraging the public anxiety to extort the crown." "Your recommendation?" Vivian asked, her pen hovering over her notepad. "Force," Davies said smoothly. "We deploy the provincial riot units to secure the factory perimeters. We freeze the union's banking assets by noon today. If they cannot access their strike funds, they cannot feed their families. Hunger is a highly effective negotiator, ma'am. They will be back on the looms by Thursday." A murmur of agreement rippled down the table. It was clean. It was mathematical. Josephine looked at Davies's hands. His cuticles were perfectly manicured. His cuffs were stark white, held together by sapphire links. He had never missed a meal in his life. Suddenly, she wasn't in a palace anymore. She was standing in the foyer of her Seattle home, listening to Bennett tell her he was locking down her joint accounts, threatening to leave her on the street because she didn't obey him. She remembered the sheer, cold terror of financial vulnerability, the realization that without money, you ceased to be a person and became a problem. "No," Josephine said. The word was quiet, but it dropped onto the mahogany table like a live grenade. 14 heads snapped toward her. Vivian's pen stopped moving. She turned her head slowly, her precise blue eyes locking onto her sister. There was a warning there, sharp and clear. Davies blinked, a patronizing smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I beg your pardon, Your Highness?" Josephine leaned forward. The adrenaline was completely gone now, replaced by a cold, cynical clarity. "You will not freeze their accounts, Chancellor. Ma'am, with all due respect, you have been absent for several years," Davies said, his tone dripping with false deference. "You are perhaps unfamiliar with the current economic hostility. I am perfectly familiar with how it feels to have your bank accounts weaponized against you, Chancellor, Josephine cut in, her voice stripping away his polished veneer. When you freeze their funds, you don't break their spirit. You validate their hatred. You prove to them that the Crown views them as collateral damage. They are breaking the law, Minister Cole interjected from the end of the table. They are freezing, Josephine shot back. The cost of heating oil has risen 30% since October. I read the briefing on the plane. A 20% wage increase is exorbitant, yes, but they are asking for 20 because they expect us to counter at 10. This isn't a rebellion. It's a negotiation. She looked at Vivian. Her sister's face was an unreadable mask. If you send in riot police, Josephine continued, her voice dropping an octave, losing its tremor, someone will throw a bottle, a guard will swing a baton, a photograph of a bleeding textile worker will be on the front page of every European paper by tomorrow morning. The Parliament will use it as proof that the monarchy is violently unstable, and they will force the vote of no confidence. The room was deathly quiet. So, Josephine said, leaning back in her chair, the leather creaking softly, we will not freeze their accounts. We will announce a temporary winter subsidy for all northern provinces, funded directly from the Royal Discretionary Trust. And you, Chancellor Davies, will get in a car, drive to Oak Haven, and negotiate a 12% wage increase. You will do it without a police escort. Davies turned a mottled, furious shade of red. He looked at Vivian for salvation. Your Highness, surely we cannot capitulate to... The princess has given you a directive, Arthur, Vivian interrupted. Her tone was flat, but Josephine caught the microscopic gleam of approval in her sister's eye. Vivian saw the political math. It was flawless. I suggest you order your car. The rest of the briefing was a blur of budgets and border logistics. Josephine sat through it, the heavy ring pressing into her skin, anchoring her to the table. When the meeting finally adjourned, the ministers filed out quickly, eager to escape the suffocating tension. Vivienne remained seated. She closed her leather folio. You've grown teeth, Vivienne murmured to the empty room. I had to, Josephine replied, staring at the grain of the mahogany table. The world is full of men who think they can starve you out. Vivian stood up. Come, it's time. They walked in silence to the west wing, where the air grew thick with the smell of medical alcohol, iodine, and the faint ozone tang of oxygen concentrators. The king's bedchamber had been transformed into an intensive care unit. Monitors beeped in a slow, erratic rhythm. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight. Josephine walked to the edge of the massive four-poster bed. Her grandfather looked impossibly small, his skin translucent and bruised purple where IV lines disappeared into his veins. His chest rose and fell with a terrible rattling effort. She reached out and took his hand. It was freezing. His eyelids fluttered open. His eyes, milky with age, drifted around the room before focusing on her face. He didn't look surprised. He just looked impossibly tired. His gaze slid downward, resting on her hand. He saw the gold signet ring. A tiny, almost imperceptible squeeze grasped her fingers. He closed his eyes again. A long, shuddering exhale left his lips. Josephine stood by the bed, listening to the rain begin to lash against the palace windows. It sounded exactly like the rain in Seattle. But she wasn't a captive anymore. She had traded a small cage for a massive one, but this time she held the keys. She squeezed the old man's hand back, feeling the sharp edges of the gold ring bite into her own flesh. It hurt, and she was finally ready to bear it. Thank you for listening to this story. Josephine's journey from a silenced wife to a reclaimed royal shows that sometimes the hardest step isn't walking away. It's walking back to who you were always meant to be. If you enjoyed this dramatic tale of betrayal, quiet strength, and ultimate empowerment, please hit the like button. Share this video with anyone who loves a story about a woman taking back her crown, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more deep, emotional, and compelling audio stories delivered straight to your feed. See you in the next one.